Go back to this and refer to it and connect with me if you have not thus far. I don't want to change that page. Let me just go here. So, yes. At a very high level? Yeah. Yeah, but one of the things, just to keep in mind, one of the things that I do is I'm not great at focus. So when I'm covering the knowledge areas that are mine to cover, I refer to those others all the time. And I talk about how they connect and why they feed each other. So I talk fast, so it kind of helps me fit that in, but I will most definitely do that for you. Absolutely. If you have not connected with me on LinkedIn, I welcome you to do so. I've been doing business analysis for about 20 to 25 years. I've been certified for 8. Sorry, I had to think about what year it was. um, I've been involved with IBA from the moment I learned of its existence. I'm very passionate about it. I speak publicly about it. I have done this work at 10 companies over many verticals, and I've worked in almost every functional, from a business analysis perspective, in almost every functional area of an organization. I've worked with tire care guys, I've worked with accounting, I've worked with HR, I've worked with IT, I work all of them. And I have a software development degree, 4.0. Only thing I took away really was I don't want to do it. And I have worn all the hats that all of us find ourselves wearing, with the BA, the PM, the QA, the sometimes the developer, all of it. So I just recently have, with my growth into my certification, it allowed me the opportunity to be seen as an expert, which allowed me more opportunity to focus on my skill set that I really, really love. I still find myself having to do some of those others, and that's fine, but I really get the chance to do this more, and I have an opportunity to mentor others in it, and that's what I really, 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 really love. So with that being said, that's who I am. I have been called the punk rocker of business analysis. I don't look like one, but I guess I sound like one, and my humor is interesting with that. So I will be controlling that some. It might peek out here and there. If it offends anybody, I am truly apologetic up front, but hopefully you find it to be comic relief in this crazy whirlwind of vomiting all kinds of business analysis information on you really, really, really fast and hoping that it sticks. We are available to you for mentoring, throughout your process. So please keep that in mind as we move through this content very quickly. With that being said, the knowledge areas you covered yesterday, business analysis, planning, and monitoring, yuck, not my favorite one. Just being honest, I'm a lot of structured chaos. I really like the creative areas of business analysis a lot more, so the planning and monitoring is not all that fun for me. But that's kind of the process of planning and monitoring and elicitation and collaboration, which you covered yesterday, is kind of what kicks everything off, because someone comes to you and says, hey, I have this problem, and you start figuring out, okay, who are the players and who do I need to talk to and why, and then you start figuring out, okay, you start understanding those stakeholders, and you perform that stakeholder analysis, and then you figure out, okay, so how do they like to be talked to? How do I need to approach them? And how do I stay within the scope of all of this? So you're hitting the planning and monitoring, but you're also eliciting and collaborating while you're doing that, because you have to talk to people to figure that out most of the time. Or you elicit information and understanding from org charts or other stuff that you can get a hold of. So planning and monitoring is all about making sure that you're being thoughtful in your approach to business analysis, and that you are being you're being thorough, you're keeping track of things, you're managing understanding, and then you're also growing with it, right? You're looking back at what you did and evaluating it to see, could I've done something better? And that's the monitoring part of it. So planning and monitoring is all about figuring out who are the players and all of that kind of stuff. Now, to make this easier to talk about, let me pull something up here. I should have already had this up because I refer to it off and on in my training. And elicitation and collaboration, that's where we talk to people, right? We elicit information we do not gather. That's a pet peeve of any certified business analyst. They don't like to be referred to as gathering because it implies that it's just laying there and ready to be taken. And it's not. We have to dig and dig and dig and use psychology and be creative with our approach to trying to pull that information out of people and things. Um, so another piece of this, which a lot of people don't like, and they think about business analysis with the word governance a lot, and that's one of the things that gives us a kind of like that black sheep kind of feel because no one wants to engage us because we slow everything down, and that's not true. And I speak to that a little bit throughout training as well. So that's BAPM in a nutshell. Are we doing things well? How am I managing and sharing my information? How am I governing it, meaning keeping track of statuses, assessing, is this really what we want to do? Controlling the change essentially. Who am I talking to? What are their quirks? What are their preferences? And then with all of that stuff, just planning my approach and elicitation and collaboration. These are really easy. I mean, it's like a meeting. You prepare for your meeting, you conduct the meeting, you confirm the results of the meeting, and then you communicate it out. This stuff is pretty straightforward on the content. It's a lot harder than these tasks make it sound because you have to do this. Basically, what 4.5 means is you're a psychologist. In your process of business analysis, you're addressing fear, you're addressing conflict, you're managing relationships, not just yours with others, but others with others. And so that's very, very important. Did that help? Yes. Eliciting. You bet. Eliciting, because gathering, and if you look them up in like your Webster's dictionaries or anything like that, gathering implies that you just pick something up that's laying there, right? It's visible, it's present. It's like going into the field and picking corn or picking tomatoes or whatever, right? You just gather it up. It's the corn sitting there on the stalk and you pull it off. You can see it. Eliciting is you have to draw it out. You have to pull it out of people. You have to get them to trust you. It's just eliciting is it says to draw forth, to pull forth. And I believe it says something about with effort. It requires effort, right? And so this is so much harder than gathering. And that this process right here, it's one of your shorter chapters, but because of this right here, it's one of your more complicated chapters to execute because it involves it involves people and their pesky things called feelings. Is that someone on the phone asked for a recap of the first two knowledge areas? Does that help? Okay. All right, so let's jump into our knowledge areas. And something else, if you have not joined IIBA yet, I highly recommend it so that you can get a copy of this BABOK for free in a digital perspective. At the beginning of every chapter, for those of you that don't know it, at the beginning of every chapter, you have inputs and outputs for the entire chapter in the tasks. So it gives you that high-level picture. But also for every task within the knowledge area, at the front of it, it has these little thingies. And these are very, very helpful for studying. So if you don't have a copy of your BABOK, I recommend that you get a copy of the BABOK. The study guides are really, really great. But at the same time, I don't recommend skipping a read of the BABOK. You need to read the BABOK. Okay, on to our content. So the first content we're going to cover today is requirements lifecycle management. It's another yucky. This one and BAPM, they're not my favorites. I'm just going to be honest. So I tend to move through it fairly quickly. Again, interrupt me if something doesn't make sense or because I really want to ensure that you get it. It's important that you understand this before I hit the next thing because I don't want confusion to grow. I would rather squelch it right up front. So with the stuff that we've talked about so far between Peter and that very, very brief recap I gave you, from your perspective, would you say that requirements have lives? Okay, awesome, because they do. Do they survive beyond the project? Mm-hmm. Because if they didn't, why are we doing the project in the first place, right? A need is a need. Just because it's satisfied doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Now, that doesn't mean they don't die. They can die, and they usually do, and it's triggered by something like technology advancement, company shift in structure or strategy or things like that, right? But from the perspective of requirements, they do. They live. They have lives of their own. Let me get this out of my way. I don't know why I didn't move that already. I don't think you could see it, but okay. So, and I don't agree with this is just whoa. Sorry. Apparently I can't use my mouse very as excitedly as I use my voice. So this is not accurate necessarily because requirements happen, they happen here. They happen well above, outside of a project life cycle, a requirement is born. And so the requirement is born outside of the life cycle of the project, and they do exist beyond implementation. And if we're doing our jobs well, we validate that life is continual and it's continually being met. And so we'll get more into that in a little bit. So requirements lifecycle management. This is where we talk about, this is where we manage our requirements from the beginning of beginning of our awareness of them until such time as they are no longer needed. So from inception to retirement of the requirement. And this knowledge area is also about how do those relate to one another? What's the traceability between them? And can we reuse these requirements? We should be documenting our requirements in a way that they can be reused. And that's the beauty of having a business analyst. Now, there's that shift in our world of methodology that makes that third one really, really hard to accomplish. Agile makes requirements reuse very complicated, if not impossible. Now, I think from what I've been able to see in the industry, and I believe there's a shift in Agile that's starting to take better advantage of business analysts, and it's starting to allow itself to be Agile. Because it's funny, when I go in and I'm trying to get organizations to, they're saying our process of requirements is so inefficient and it's not very effective, and I get in there and I'm like, well, you're not really doing business analysis. You're just going in a room and talking about things and documenting very, very little and then just hoping that you're right. And I mean, doing things quickly is great, but you got to at least stop and think and document things in a way that you can reuse them later to speed up that process. And your first couple of iterations or Agile are going to slow down, but with that reusability over time, it's going to get faster and faster without losing quality. And so IIBA wants us to differentiate our requirements. They want us to do it in a way that's reusable. They want us to be powerful and efficient and effective and things like that. And that's what lifecycle management is about. Traceability and reusability have been lost in many, many environments. And we're going to talk about that some today and why it's so valuable to do it. It sucks. It's not fun to do at all. But the pain it saves you later is significantly important, right? It's just like life. You know, sometimes we have to do the things that aren't very fun to get the reward later. So delayed gratification, which we're not really great at anymore. Yes. Oh, whoa, whoa, whoa. Whoa, what happened? I will be covering that. We have a whole slide or two on reusability. Mm-hmm. One second, please. Sorry, my coffee went down the wrong way. Okay, I think we're okay. Oh my goodness, I am so sorry, guys. Whew, that's a way to wake up. Okay, yeah, we'll cover all of that later. Wow, that was fun. I'm awake. Whew, that made me warm. All right. So one of the things that is important for us to realize is the difference between a requirements life. And this kind of lumps BA and project together, but it's not. And that's something that's very important for you to realize, although your environments that you work in are probably not going to very readily. I sound worse than I am. I'm fine right now. Okay, so the requirement is born usually from a business person saying, hey, we have this problem we need to solve, or we have an opportunity we want to take advantage of. In an ideal world, which most of us don't live in, they say, hey, we have this person called a business analyst. Maybe we should engage them, and the business analyst gets involved. And we start doing our elicitation and collaboration and stuff like that, start asking a lot of qualifying questions, and then we either realize one of two things. That requirement actually didn't need to exist, and we retire it immediately, and we resolve that, what caused that to be requested, different way, like we identify that they need to stop a behavior that they were exhibiting, or they just didn't know how to use a system, right? Something like that. Or maybe the requirement does spawn off a project, so the business analyst engages in the project lifecycle at that point. So there's a business analysis lifecycle. It starts with your requirements lifecycle, which may or may not bring in the business analysis lifecycle, which may or may not bring in the project lifecycle. So, and the project lifecycle ends before the business analysis lifecycle ends, before the requirement lifecycle ends. And we'll talk about that more as we get through this knowledge area. So the tasks we're going to cover, these tasks aren't the most fun tasks we're going to cover this weekend. So we're going to talk about traceability, and that's something that not a lot of people do. Then we're going to talk about maintaining those requirements and making sure that they keep prioritization updated. We're going to talk about if something were to change, how do we assess that change and manage it, and then how do we get things approved. So these are the tasks we're going to cover for this knowledge area. So let's move on to task 2. Task 1. Yep. Okay, so task 1, we're going to talk about traceability. This is not done very often from what I can surmise. Traceability, what do you think it means? When I say, what do we mean by trace and why should we do it? Does someone want to take a stab at that? Okay, excellent. So you trace it to you trace requirements to one another. You relate it to other elements and you relate it to solution elements. Is that what I heard? Okay. You're fine. You're still learning, but that was great. That was actually really great. Why should we do that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very good. So it helps us maintain the scope. It helps us make sure that we're taking care of everything and not doing anything unnecessary, right? And it also helps us. Evaluate when we find a change, right? So requirements traceability is our ability to look at a requirement and understand how it relates to other elements and why. So the most common traceability that you see is that, like you just mentioned, that drilled down to the further depth of detail, right? So we start at the business, it goes to stakeholder. In all honesty, I don't write very many stakeholder requirements. It goes down into solution requirements, which are functional and non-functional, and ultimately into transition requirements, right? So what are the transition requirements we have in order to meet these requirement needs? It also allows us to trace those requirements to other elements like solution components or issues or risks or any of those elements, right? So it allows us to connect a requirement with either other requirements that caused it or it is causational to, or things that it may impact. So that's what requirements traceability gives us. It allows us the opportunity to make sure that everything's in alignment, right? Make sure we're in alignment with all of the requirements are in alignment with one another. It helps us manage scope. It helps us make sure that we're meeting the requirement, the strategic requirement that we are going after. And it also helps us manage change. Impact analysis is so much easier when we've done the pain of traceability. Now, there are three kinds of traceability, and I want you to ignore the words in red because derivation can be backward or forward, and so can allocation be backward or forward. So backward traceability is when I look and I say, where did this come from, right? And then forward traceability is where I say, where is this going to? And then there's the peer related to like cross-relational. Now we're going to get into derivation and allocation in just a moment, and I'll show you or I'll talk about how it impacts backward and forward at that time. But the most important thing is to understand backward, forward, and related. Those are the three traceability elements that you need to be aware of. And backward means I look back to see what this is related to. Forward means I look forward to see what it's related to, but I also need to look side to side. So an example of a traceability matrix. Now I'm going to ask you to use your imagination a little bit here. I want you to pretend that there's a column right here that says related requirement. Okay, so right now what you are seeing is managed schedule is allocated into release 3 and is related to use case, this use case. Okay, that's where you're seeing that. Now, if you are keeping track of your contacts and you're using more of a normalized database structure, then this would be related to this other data element, right? So you would have that relatability. Now pretend that there's a related requirement here. Requirement 10,000 is managed schedule. Well, that doesn't tell you a lot, right? There's a lot of stuff to that. So pretend you have 10,001 and it has a requirement of allocate resource. And then the related requirement is going to be 10,000. So what I've done right there is I've said this requirement ID 10,000 is derived into 10,001 of assign resource or allocate resource. So that's a forward traceability of derivation. And derivation is cause. It means this caused this or this was caused by this, right? So forward or backward. So I can look at 10,001 and it says allocate resources and I see, oh, it's related to requirement 10,000. Well, that means allocate resources is derived from requirement 10,000, which is managed schedule. Okay, so now I have allocation into release 3. I have a related connection to use case, and then I have a derivation into a requirement that was a result of this higher level requirement. Now we're going to get into the theory of that now, like right after benefits of traceability. So one of the things that traceability does for us is it makes sure that our solution that we're designing, it conforms to the requirements. So what happens when you use traceability, you've got all these requirements written, you start doing screen designs, or you start doing some things like that, and you have to look at those screens and you have to ask yourself, every element of a screen has to trace back to a actual solution requirement, or it's called gold plating. And that helps us manage the scope, right? And so now it's not us saying something is out of scope. It is our written requirements, our scope diagrams. It's this data that's saying it's out of scope. And that makes managing your relationships a lot easier. So if we do the necessary documentation, it has many impacts or effects that a lot of people don't necessarily maintain awareness of. So traceability helps us manage scope. It helps us manage risk, and we make sure that everything stays strategic. And it also helps improve relationships because it's the traceability that's speaking for us. It's not us. Now, on the contrary, it actually helps us find missing functionalities. If I've got these screen mockups and I've got requirements and I haven't been able to trace these requirements into these screen mockups or trace these requirements into these solution components of a vendor solution, then that means I'm missing capability that has to be there for my business to be able to function well, right? So it helps us do that. Another benefit is the impact analysis. I mentioned that before. So if you're doing traceability, and yes, You bet. hmm So did you need to take some notes here? Right. Yeah. And so keep in mind also that you're going to be able to watch this again when you need to. Yep. Okay. So, benefits of traceability. I talked a little bit about impact analysis. So, with impact analysis, it's where, if I've done traceability well and someone comes to me, we're kind of in the middle of either we're in the middle of the technical implementation process where we're, building out, we're configuring vendor solutions or we're coding or something like that. And someone comes to us and tells us, oh, wait, you know what, that requirement isn't quite what we expected or needed. And we learn that sometimes, right, when we're trying to configure a system or develop a system. So when that comes up, if we've done good traceability, I can say, okay, here's this requirement. Now, if I change this requirement, what other requirements touch this? And I can see the cascaded effect potentially. And now I'm not having to hunt and peck and put all that effort into trying to figure out what is the impact. I have a report or I have this traceability that speaks for me, and it makes it a lot easier. I mentioned earlier that it helps us make sure that our requirements are covered. If we can't if we can't recognize a forward traceability and an allocation into a solution component for a requirement, that means that requirement may not be met. And that helps us ensure that the requirements will be met when we push this solution out. And the requirements allocation, right? So those two go together. The Well, the impact analysis, there's this kind of a technique. It's not necessarily a task. When you do impact analysis, it's just you have a requirement and you look at all of the other requirements that are related to that requirement and you evaluate it to determine impact. That's not something we teach in this class. It's just the theoretical understanding of what is that is what's important at this time. Um, Impact analysis itself is there. It's like it's scattered throughout the BABOK. It's impact analysis is simply it's really just as simple as you've done traceability and you have a change to a requirement and you evaluate all of the related requirements to determine based on the change I'm making to this requirement, does that materially impact these other requirements? Does it change my understanding of these other requirements? Or does it change my ability to meet these other requirements? So it's really that straightforward. What kind of understanding are you looking for? How to go about it and teaching you how to do it, or okay, right? Um, just like everything else in the BABOK, you could get a question on it. Um, and that's the application piece. The BABOK doesn't teach you how to do anything. It teaches you what is business analysis and what are the techniques, and it teaches you the theory. The practical application of it is something that you either learn through doing or you take specific courses that are intended to teach you the how of these things. Does that make sense? You bet. Okay, the elements of traceability. This is where we talked about, we're about to dig into some of those details I glossed over with the for, the allocation, the derivation, all of that. So the first thing we're going to ask ourselves about is a level of formality. So how formal is our environment when it comes to traceability? What kind of relationships are we going to trace and not going to trace? And how are we going to store that information? So we're going to go into each one of these over the next few slides. Level of formality. So in an environment, it's important. Some environments don't tolerate traceability at all, which is extremely unfortunate. So because, and it's often because they don't understand the value of it. Now, we should be allowed to be flexible as business analysts, because one of the important things we need to be able to do is we need to be able to assess how valuable will it be when I perform this task. And so if I'm talking about changing a sort order on a report and traceability hasn't been done before, well, if I'm in an environment that's pretty formalized, they may not care how expensive it is. They may want me to go backward and do all that traceability. But it would not have high value, because changing a sort order on a report is not going to have a high value associated with trying to do traceability from scratch, right? So it's important that everything we do as business analysts, we're evaluating the value that would be delivered, because as soon as we start doing things that don't provide as much value as the effort we place in at a minimum, then we're going to be seen as a bottleneck. And it's going to be harder for us to accomplish the things that we are capable of and can provide. Traceability. Okay, so this says traceability is expensive. I would say traceability can be expensive. If you are doing traceability with Excel, it's expensive. It's not easy to do. The tool that I use, the way I go about writing my requirements, traceability is built into my tool. It's not hard to do with my tool, because I have an actual requirements management tool. So if you have a requirements management tool, traceability is not very expensive. It's just part of the nature of the tool that you use. But if you're in an environment, which a lot of people are, and you're using things like Jira or Excel or any of those things, traceability is expensive. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, I will. I will share that closer to the end. That's like when either when the news, when the news comes on and they give you the hint of that, like the really 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 cool news story, and then they give you all the stuff you don't really care about and make you wait. I'm going to do that to you. Sorry. No, that's not a requirements tool. No. Yes. Well, so again, that depends on the tool that you have available to you, and the environment that you're in. That's one of the things about business analysis. There is no definitive answer to any of your questions usually. So if you're in an environment that's highly formalized, and so they want traceability, but they don't give you the tools to make it easy, then you're going to spend a decent amount of time doing traceability. And I don't have a percentage for you. I can tell you that business analysis should be, there should be as much time spent doing business analysis, if not more, than development. Um, and that's that, yeah, and that's reusability, honestly. Yeah. Not necessarily. I don't see it that way. You may be able to look at it that way. I've never tried to look at it that way. That's not how I see it. Um, Traceability and reusability are different things, and they are not necessarily mutually inclusive. So and I think that'll come to light when I start talking a lot more about the kind of traceability and things like that in just a minute. When I talk about traceability versus reusability, that'll make it clear. Yes. That not if you're doing business analysis right. Because what happens, the reason development often takes as long as it does is because you have a lot of undo redo. And they have to stop and ask a lot of questions because need wasn't clearly defined. When you've got a business analyst working involved and doing a good job, it makes the developer's job significantly easier. So, yeah. Yep. Or closer to right. I mean, you can't, nothing's ever going to be perfect, right? But in environments that don't leverage business analysis, particularly like agile environments that don't leverage business analysis correctly, I was asked to come implement business analysis at an organization. It was a very large organization. They were doing continuous improvement work really good, so they kind of had the idea, but it's different. And so I get in there, and the very first project they assigned me to, and I was the business analysis manager, and I had a team of like 5 or 6. And the first thing they wanted me to do is assess their approach to requirements because their burn down rate was bad, and they were blaming it on their requirements process. Well, I get in there and I'm like, okay, well, first of all, you are being too strict with your agile implementation, and you're not doing business analysis, and your burn down rate is awful, right? So if you pause for just a minute, all this time that you're spending in development because you're undoing and redoing and undoing and redoing and undoing and redoing, right? Failure isn't necessarily a bad word. I agree with that, but we shouldn't like rush to it. So, but I also don't believe in the waterfall where you try to define all this stuff up front, because by the time you get it figured out, you don't need it anymore because this world changes too fast. But there's that like, so it's like Goldilocks, right? One bed's too hard, one bed's too soft. We need to find the bed that's just right. And so that's where if I was explaining to them, you allow business analysis to start before your agile stuff hits. And then in the middle of agile, you do business analysis more effectively, and you give it a little more attention, and you pause just long enough for it to do its job right, then development's going to go faster. And so when you do that, that ratio of business analysis to development gets a lot closer to even, if and sometimes goes heavier into the business analysis, because business analysis starts before the project life cycle if you're doing it right. Now, because business analysis should start before the project life cycle, that you wind up having more time doing business analysis. But if you look at the overall effort, the overall number of hours that are spent from inception to the time that you implement a requirement, it's actually less effort and less time. It just doesn't feel like it, because for some reason we feel like when we actually code or when we actually implement and configure, work is happening. And when a business analyst does their thing, it's not work happening because it's not as tangible. So it's this psychological shift that has to happen. I'm sorry, I think I went off on a tangent. I did it, you guys didn't. Did that help? Or did it? Okay. Okay. So the elements of traceability. This is kind of just it gives you something to relate to. One business requirement will result in one or more stakeholder requirements. Every stakeholder requirement will result in one or more solution requirements, and those solution requirements can trace into one or more solution components. Now, it's not exactly like this, right? And you won't document procedures or database objects. You might do some UI work. You might do some test cases, but these kind of things you won't necessarily document. So all of this stuff isn't necessarily what you document, but if you're working in an environment that's doing it well, like my tool integrates with TFS. So when I document my requirements, they convert directly into work items in TFS, and I can see every procedure, every call, every object in the code that relates back to that requirement. And so that actually allows me to not just do traceability or impact analysis on my requirements, but I can actually say, hey, if I change this requirement, what code objects are going to be impacted? What should we look at to see what we need to change? Now, I've never worked in a place that is comfortable enough to execute at that level, but it's possible. So let's talk about the relationship types. This is where we start getting into derivation, yada, yada. Okay, derive. Derive is causational. Derive means I caused this or I was caused by this. So you will say, I'm going to derive this requirement into, I'm going to derive this business requirement into this stakeholder requirement. That's derivation that's forward. If I look at this stakeholder requirement, I say this stakeholder requirement was derived from this business requirement. Okay, so that's derivation that is backward traceability. So this is why I was telling you to ignore those red words on that first slide that said backward, forward, and it specified forward is derive, backward is, backward is derive, forward is allocate. That's not true because it can be backward and forward. So I can derive into or I can be derived from something. So derive is causational. Dependency is for this requirement to met, this other requirement must be met. So again, it can be forward and backward, or it can be related. So I can say this requirement is dependent upon this other requirement. Okay, so then I can say this other requirement depends on, is depended on by this other requirement. So you can see which requirements are dependent upon a requirement, and you can also see which requirements are depended on by requirements, right? So you can see that dependency relationships. If you have a project management mind, yes, because predecessor is a project management term, huh? Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. Yep. Wait, so 10,001 is allocate resources. 10,001 is there, that's not a dependency, that's a derivation. Okay, but if you say for me to do, let's say, because when you say manage schedule, derivation, you don't want to use derivation and depend together, because then that can get confusing. It's important that you differentiate between them. So derivation is causational. Dependency is, they aren't necessarily directly related, but they're dependent upon one another. For example, if you say that you need to, let's say that you need to have a certain amount of hard drive space to accommodate growth factor, right? So that's, you need some scalability. Scalability would be dependent upon a transition requirement of obtaining a server, because your current server is not important enough. Now, those aren't necessarily causational, but they are dependency. You could say that business analysis has to be done before project management can be done, right? Business analysis needs to be done right, so we only do the projects that are associated. That's not a derivation. Project management and business analysis, although they're related, they aren't causational with each other, but they are dependent upon one another. So I'm trying to come up with an example off the top of my head, and I'm having a hard time when it comes to like requirements, because allocating is next. Satisfaction, that's the same thing as allocation, and that's different than dependency. Yeah, there you go. Yep, that would work. So a requirement would be that the solution must have the IVR setup complete. And then another requirement would be that the IVR can be executed upon, but that's dependent upon it being complete, the setup being complete. So that would work for dependency. They're not necessarily derivational, but they are dependent. And then we have satisfy. So satisfy is when you have screen mockups or vendor components or things like that. And you say these requirements are met by these solution components. That's satisfaction. So you would say this requirement is satisfied by this screen mockup. You would say the screen mockup satisfies this requirement. So that's forward and backward traceability, but it's about satisfying or meeting the need. Okay. And then we have validation. This is where you have test cases that validate a need was met. Now, please don't confuse this to be quality assurance. You are not QA, and the test may try to trick you with that. This is an area that is very, it can get really tricky on your exam. So validation is ensuring the need is met, not ensuring the system works. Okay, that's very, very different. So validation is where we say, when I execute this test case, it tells me whether or not this requirement is actually going to be met. So in the words of the Babok, this test case validates that this requirement is met. That's backward. I can look at my requirement and say this requirement is validated by this test case. That is forward validation. So validation is again forward and backward. So does that make sense with those four? We're going to go into them a little bit more. Derivation, pretty straightforward. Does anyone have questions about derivation? We've talked about this a bit throughout the last few slides. Okay, let's talk about dependency. This is where we say we can only do this if this other one is implemented, right? So we've talked about that some. Shopping cart is dependent upon a payment gateway. If I don't have a payment gateway, my shopping cart is pointless. Same thing with your IVR. I can't turn on the IVR unless it's been set up. That's a dependency. A dependency is not necessarily forward or backward. It's usually related. It can be forward or backward, but it's usually a related, like a peer-to-peer. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Yep. But a PO doesn't necessarily feed into the invoice per se. It can in some systems because you can automate the process, but in some systems it's not required, right? You have a PO, you have an invoice, you match them, right? So they're independent of one another when it comes to, meaning they're not causational, but your process, right, but your process requires one to be there for the other one to be completed. Yes. You have to go create a PO, right? Yeah. Yep. Even if it's just a dummy PO that's a holding place. Yep. Okay. Okay, satisfaction. We talked about this, right? This is where we have a component of a solution and it satisfies a particular requirement, or a particular requirement is satisfied by the implementation of a specific solution component, right? Any questions about that? So when you do a screen mockup, right, and you have a specific field, or you have a drop down, or you have a calculation that occurs, that field is necessary, or that feature is necessary because of these requirements. That's a satisfaction thing. If I have requirements that I can't say, if I can't say this requirement is satisfied by this specific component of this solution, then I haven't met that requirement. And if I look at my solution and I say, and I can't, if I've got a piece on my solution, let's say that there's a really cool capability that the developer wants to put in place, but I can't trace that component, that really cool thing he wants to do, to any specific requirement, that means it's gold plating and not necessary. I can't do a satisfaction trace. If I can't do a satisfaction trace for a requirement, that means it's not being met. If I can't do a satisfaction trace for an element in my solution, that means it's unnecessary. Or that I missed a requirement. I mean, that's possible, but it's usually because it's unnecessary. And it helps us avoid gold plating. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And then we have the validation. This is the test case, validates the requirements. It's, what is it not? What are we not? It's not QA. I'm not a QA person. I was a QA lead at a software company. Don't want to do it again. Um, So I'll make sure that the needs are met, but someone else needs to see if they can break the solution and do the, do the automated regression testing, scripting, and stuff like that. Not it, preferably. That doesn't mean I'm not a team player. I'll help out if I can, but I prefer not to do that. Yes, absolutely. Because regression testing, automated testing, that's all about ensuring that you didn't accidentally break something else. That's not validating need is met. That's testing the solution to make sure that it doesn't break. That's not BA. Hmm. Um, yep, yep, yeah, yeah. They're gonna drill it down. They're gonna try to kill it. Yep. They test all the details. They test things that, they do all the negative path testing. They do all kinds of things that a business analyst won't engage in. So they take the business analyst test cases and they blow them out. When you've got an environment that leverages BA right and leverages QA right, they love each other, because business analysts make the QA jobs easier, and the QA role being in existence allows the business analyst to focus on business analysis. So yes, and that's a confusion. Yes. Yeah. And a lot of environments I have been engaged with or talked to, they seem to think that UAT should be driven by QA, and that they shouldn't. Because if you think about what are the kind of conversations that happen in UAT, you sit the people down, right, and they start using the solution, and you say, hey, so this is what we did for you. Is that meeting your need? Yes, awesome. No, okay, why not? And then you start doing business analysis, and the most appropriate resource to do that is the resource that did the business analysis in the first place, because you already have an understanding of all of those requirements, how they affected one another, and you can immediately in your head do some of the impact analysis, and it'll drive you to ask other questions that a QA person that's just focused on, is the system working, won't necessarily think about. They don't necessarily elicit requirements the way you do, right? Now, in my opinion, UAT should have a QA person in the room. And if you have an environment that's highly mature, and your developers and the QA and the BA, they all know how to work together, and they don't go way off course when you do this, the most successful UATs I've ever had, I have my developer in the room, I have my QA person in the room. I'm walking the users through this. They uncover a problem. We discuss it in the moment. They correct an understanding. While we're talking about it, the developer's developing it, pushing the change to QA's QA, and I'm still working through validation. QA says, hey, we have a fix for that. We can push that out. I've tested it. It looks great. Let's do that. And in the moment, they push it out, and I re-show it to my business, and they're like, oh, yeah, that's much better, right? Or we uncover new problems. But that's extremely valuable. But unfortunately, I've only been in one environment that does that right. And I've been in 11 environments so far, 10 or 11. So it's not common. But yes, business analysts validate, QA truly tests, right? They check for quality. Business analysis validates need is met, QA person makes sure it doesn't break. And then we have to store it somewhere, right? How are we going to store? What is our tool or manual approach for maintaining these traceabilities? Usually people wind up using Excel. That's so painful and it's expensive because it takes so much work to maintain it. If you're lucky, you have an actual repository that is centralized and leverages an actual relational database for you to do your traceability with. That's ideal. And there's some tools that do that better than others. And we'll talk about those later. Your summary slides, these are really, really great for studying because when it comes to the theory and methodology questions, you're going to be asked what's the, you're going to be given a question about the purpose and you're going to be asked to match that to a task or knowledge area. You're going to be given inputs, you're going to be given a knowledge area or a task, and you're going to be asked which of the following is not an input, stuff like that. So this is very, very helpful for memorization. ECBA is mostly about memorization. CCBA has a little bit of memorization. And then CBAP doesn't have memorization questions at all, but I highly recommend you do memorize these things because you're going to have so many complicated questions that you just want the method, the terminology and the theory, you want that just natural part of your brain so that you can have freedom to think about the complicated questions. All right. Any questions before we pause for a break? Yes. So the ECBA the ECBA is all theory and all understanding of theory and knowledge. So that's just about, do you know the content, not necessarily how you can apply it. Now, CCBA will have some of those exact same questions, but a decent percentage of the CCBA test is going to be application. It's going to be like, you find yourself in this situation, which of the following should you do? That's where you're having to say, okay, I understand the terminology and the theory. Now I have to apply it to this specific situation. So ECBA is going to say, here's a purpose. Which of what task does this describe? And it's going to give you a list, right? That's theory. That's just theory understanding. Which of the following is not an output for this specific task? Which of the following is a stakeholder for this task? That's all about memorizing the content. But with CCBA, you'll also have a situation where you'll be told, you need to approach a business unit that is failing to meet KPIs. Which of the following approaches would you use? And it will give you a list of approaches. All right, it actually tests your ethics. It tests your understanding of applying the knowledge. It'll say you need to go into a situation where you're going to be eliciting information that you have never been engaged in before. Which of the following would be the most appropriate approach? And then it'll say individual interviews and brainstorming and strategy and requirements workshop, or things like that, workshop. And so you're going to be saying, oh, well, ideally you have a workshop because you need a diverse group of people so you can uncover all the stuff you don't know, and then later you might get into the interviews with the one-off stuff that you didn't get clear, right? So that's about understanding how do I use these things? When do I use these things? And being able to apply that executable knowledge to a question. Does that help? Okay. And those of you that are doing CCBA, you're going to get additional help from LN over the next couple of weeks. I think I actually have you next Sunday, but okay. Okay, so let's take a break. And